virtual, remote, data-driven. I feel like that's almost helped us from a data perspective because everyone's looking to that more versus like, I'm going to walk over to so-and-so's desk and ask them how they're doing. Now it's more, it's almost like a data default now. So I was actually worked in the legal world for about 10, 12 years. I was paralegal. I was working, worked at a law firm and then moved into like in-house corporate jobs. And then in 2008, when everybody lost their jobs, I was one of those people, and I moved to Chicago. I had a contract job as a paralegal, but it was temporary. I didn't know what was going to happen. And then I got recruited by a wonderful girl that's still a friend of mine, as she called me and said, do you want to think about this sales operations job? And I said, what in the world is that? And she explained it to me. I'd never even heard of it before, because coming in from a legal side, that's not a thing you would be familiar with. Like, we didn't even have sales teams that I interacted with at all when I was in legal, because I wasn't doing like sales contracts. It wasn't from that angle. I was doing real estate law. So a totally different side of the world. And so yeah, someone had to explain to me what it was. They told me the particular job that I was coming in for was a startup, and it was, a lot of it was going to be contracts. So they said, you know, your background would translate because you'll be writing all the sales contracts for the sales team. And I said, you know, what do I have to lose? Because I was unemployed at the time, or basically, and said, sure, I'll try it. And then 3 weeks after I started at that company, typical startup, it was about 40 people, and the Salesforce admin quit. And they said, now you're the Salesforce admin. And I said, and what's Salesforce again? Because I had just walked in the door and I really didn't even know what it was. So definitely in the Salesforce world, they call that accidental admin. But I was almost accidental sales ops too. Like, these things kind of came to me. I didn't even know what they were, but just immediately really, really loved Salesforce, especially, but then loved managing. I was kind of the deal desk person, is sometimes what they call it in sales ops, for the first couple sales ops jobs I had. So really in deep with the contract side of the house. And then, but because I loved the Salesforce side, I eventually left sales ops and startups to go do consulting for a few years and try that out and really go like deep on Salesforce, because I just loved it. And just returned to sales ops probably about 3 years ago now. So getting back into it, missed it. And also the Salesforce world is, I don't know, I found it really interesting. I don't think I was ever going to be the best technical person around. And there's so many people that are extremely technical and skilled. I think it's like, how can I be, I feel like I could be a really great sales ops person. I was probably always going to be like a B plus Salesforce technical person at best. So I was like, oh, go back to sales ops and see if I can apply all the Salesforce stuff I did learn and take it back to more of the business side of the house. So far so good. And then pretty soon after coming back to sales ops, rev ops kind of heated up, and makes perfect sense to me, because having that kind of like overarching view of all those teams under one umbrella makes so much more sense than having everybody separated. I'm sure we can talk about that all day if we wanted to. So now for the first time, I'm in a revenue operations role where I'm kind of trying to run all the different ops teams, which is an exciting new challenge.
That RevOps piece is a huge one, and definitely one we want to get onto. I wanted to go back to something you said at the beginning, though. You know, unlike me, you were in the working world during the 2007 crash, and now we're in another huge monumental economic crisis shift, time of uncertainty. I'm curious as to whether, you weren't in ops at the time, but I'm curious as to whether you learned anything about dealing with uncertainty that you're applying in ops today, because of course, ops people are meant to provide the certainty and surety, even at a time like we're facing. I wondered if you had any reflections from your earlier life in that regard.
Yeah, I wish I had learned how to forecast in a time like this. I don't know that anybody, I mean, there's definitely methods we can apply, but it's so hard this year. It's just nearly been impossible for us to. I think it's been really important for, in my company anyway, our finance side and sales leadership and me to just be in constant communication about what's going on, because the year has just been so unpredictable. So we've all just really pulled together. I think probably that was the number one thing I learned in 08, 07, 08 was just kind of like pulling together with the people you work with and getting through it together. And that's what we're doing at Halo this year too. It's just, and looking to the future, not trying not to get too down on whatever might be happening that's out of your control in the moment, and just thinking about what steps can we take right now that'll help us next quarter, the quarter after that. If we're not, if our customers aren't that interested in talking to us, like, gosh, in like April, we could barely get any, but we sell to hospitals and health systems. So they didn't want to talk to us in April. They were overwhelmed, just completely inundated. So it's like, okay, well, what can we do for our current customers? Because they're still talking to us, because they're actually using us to manage this crisis. And then what can we do that'll line us up for new business when these hospitals come up for air and they're ready to talk again? Like, how can we just lay some groundwork and prepare for the future?
Yeah.
That's pretty much all you can do at a time like this.
Yeah, it's really good insight. I mean, that raises as well a really good question. You said that communication was a foundational piece of how you keep on going. So, how do we drive communication between different revenue teams? Like, what's your process? What's your procedure for making sure that's constant and effective?
I can tell you it's a lot easier at a smaller company than a larger one. I've worked at both. I mean, the company I worked for when I started a startup with 40 people, and then I worked at IBM with 400,000 people. So the communication challenges are very different depending on where you are. I happen to love that about the startup life, that communication is a lot easier. We all know each other. In the case of my current company, I had worked with this leadership team before. We worked together at a previous startup. So it was like our communication on day one was already there, because we've been through it together before. So that was really nice. But yeah, it was just kind of like open door policy with everything. One of the questions I think we were going to talk about was siloed communication, but the current company I work for and most startups I've worked for have been pretty transparent with each other, which is another great thing about the smaller company. As you get bigger, you kind of have to put some silos in place. Otherwise, the noise just becomes like unbearable, especially for the sellers. But right now, we have like 10 sellers. So everyone sees everything. Everybody knows everything that's going on with each other's opportunities, accounts, marketing can see everything that sales is doing. Implementation has insight into what's coming their way. It's all very, very open and transparent, which certainly makes my job easier in operations, because otherwise we're having to do a lot of that kind of visibility for people if they can't see it themselves.
Yeah, it's a good point, Allyson. It's an interesting comparison, because when we speak to people at larger organizations, they see RevOps as essential to bridging those silos in an environment where naturally they flow more easily. What's the essential job of a RevOps person in terms of alignment and communication?
I think my focus has become more on execution than communication. Like, I feel like our communication is pretty easy. One thing, and I feel like the current company I work for, the luckiest I've ever been as far as tools and tech stack usage, because every single person's on Salesforce and we use it. It's adopted, like everyone's bought in, every team uses it. So it's extremely easy from a communication perspective to show things to teams, because they're all in the same tool. that's another huge issue you see, is when marketing teams over here and their tools not integrated with the sales team and the support teams on something different, it becomes so hard. And I've had to do that. And that's where you do see, like you said, that could be the entire RevOps job, just bringing all that data together and pushing it out to different people so that they know what's going on. We're all in the same tool. We're small enough that we're very open with communicating. We have weekly meetings with the different teams. We have handoffs set up. So all that's kind of really beautifully laid out. So then it becomes, how do we execute together in sync so that we're not only not stepping on people's toes, or, but like getting the full value out of our work. So if marketing does something, they could put a ton of work into something, but they don't do it at the right time when sales needs it and like will use it and can use it, then they feel like they didn't, deliver that value. If the product team has a new product release, but they do it the last week of the quarter when sales, could care less because their heads down closing their deals, it becomes, you lose some of that momentum you could have gotten out of that execution. And I think that's where people get burnt out too, when you feel like you put your heart and soul into doing something and then it kind of falls flat and doesn't go anywhere. Yeah. It's like, okay, so how do we have all the teams working in alignment, working in sync, executing in sync, so that everybody feels like their contribution matters and gets used? So that's kind of been my job this year, kind of like my passion this year, is to bring that and surface that and talk about it a lot. So we have started calling it our operating cadence. And I think it's something we actually just launched it this quarter on a sort of trial run basis. But it's something we're all kind of bought in on, is like, how do we make sure we're communicating what these big things are that we're doing, and that we're doing them kind of in a staggered fashion so that they are kind of like flow well together, instead of, we all do something in October and we do it all at once and things fall through the cracks and customers don't even know we released a new product and that sort of thing. Yeah. So that's kind of the execution piece, I think, is the next level above communication.
Yeah, okay. So it's kind of what you're saying is, once you have people talking to each other, you need to discuss how they actually work together. And since this is an area of work, clearly you've put a lot of time into, what have you learned? What's effective? What do people need to avoid? What's your top tips?
I think, well, certainly quarter end, like I feel like people who aren't in sales maybe sometimes underestimate the intensity that is quarter end. And there's something like, I can't tell you how many companies I've worked at where something like, the product marketing team will drop like a 2-day product training on the sales team on, September 27th. And it's like, no, you don't know what it's like in quarter end. You've got to be heads down, you've got to close, the pressure's on. So really kind of making, it's almost like an empathy thing, or making other teams aware of like where those kind of painful, like intense pushes are, so that people know to avoid them with other kind of important, impactful work that they're doing. So now we've got kind of like a big event that happens in month 1 of every quarter, and that's really around training efforts. We've got a big event that happens in month 2 of every quarter, which is around like a product launch and really more of a marketing push and a customer training. And then we've got quarter end, always the fun one. So really like getting heads down and taking care of business at quarter end without distractions.
Yeah. Okay. So I'd imagine to align all of this, you need to engage stakeholders, right? Stakeholders in the business. Who are the key stakeholders and how far does it go? I mean, do CEOs get involved in this message, and how does this work?
Our CEO happens to be very passionate about this message. He actually has been incredibly involved. He's really supportive of it. He sees the value of it. And this was not an idea that I came up with or we came up with as a company. People talk about this. I watched a webinar about this. It's out there and it's out there in the world. And like Salesforce kind of lives by it, because you see them do their giant launch events and their quarterly releases, and they do 3 a year, but they are one of the, and a lot of different companies follow this kind of operating cadence. So at first, the buy-in and the stakeholders were the senior leadership team. So the head of sales, the head of marketing, the head of product, and the CEO kind of driving it and being really excited about it. But then I think with most company initiatives, if you don't have buy-in from like everyone all the way down, especially at a company my size, it's not going to work. And so it was key to get aligned at the top, but then start talking to other people, especially like people managers, team leads, make sure that they understand what we're doing, what's changing, how it will impact them, how it will benefit them. And that kind of goes to like a change management topic, which I can talk about all day too. I love that topic. It's so interesting. It's like human psychology, right? I mean, you've just gotta, it's so hard to sometimes make big change in an organization. But yeah, we're working our way through, like I said, we're just kind of starting to trial this out this quarter, but very important to make sure that everyone kind of understands. And I like to tell people straight up, like, how will it impact your job? How will it benefit you? What might change? What might be hard? What might be easy? Like, I'm a big fan of being really candid and transparent about those kinds of things. So that's the conversations we've been having at Halo.
Yeah. Now that change management piece is an interesting one, and I want to get onto the human side a bit more. But before we get there, it's interesting because I think there's almost a translational piece, isn't there, between ops and the wider organization. You look at the data, you look at the process, you look at the themes and trends, and you have to communicate those to different stakeholders. And sometimes these stakeholders have a lot on their plate. They're busy people. Maybe they aren't so interested in the data as we are. So how does that translational piece work? How do you make the data and process make sense to people who aren't ingrained in that world as much as we are?
What do you think about that one? How do we make the data and process make sense to people? I'm trying to think of an example of something that would, because most of the people, like, I don't know, maybe we have a very data driven culture. Maybe it's just that I'm lucky in that regard here too, but everyone's very interested in it. Now, I will say one thing we haven't done yet as a company, being a younger company and a growing company, it's very interesting because I feel like you see this shift around like the 50 employee mark, and we had a double shift this year because we got over 50 employees and we went remote, which is a crazy shift. That is, at this point almost seems normal, but in March, everyone worked in the same building. So it was very easy to communicate just from a walking around perspective. So going to like a kind of more of a virtual, remote, data driven, I feel like that's almost helped us from a data perspective, because everyone's looking to that more versus like, I'm going to walk over to so-and-so's desk and ask them how they're doing. Now it's almost like a data default now. Because I know we're all on Zoom all the time, but still you got to have some facts to look at, because you can't just like look up and look around and see facts with your own eyes, maybe. I don't know. I feel like it's gotten easier to point people towards data this year.
Okay, so what we're saying is, in the uncertainty and in the lacking other forms of interaction, data forms a foundational piece of interaction now.
It feels like it is. And I did switch jobs at the beginning of this year, so it's kind of an interesting, like, which came first? Was this company like this before I got here, or was this a result of COVID? I don't know. But it feels like the people at my company are embracing data in a major way. It's not like I have to convince them to look at it. Everybody wants it. Everybody's asking for it. They want more of it, not less. And even our salespeople are very, in a way I haven't experienced a lot. Our salespeople are very compliant with giving us data. Like they seem to understand, which is sometimes an uphill battle to convince a salesperson that if we have more data, we'll be able to make better decisions that will affect their compensation in the long run. It feels like we have a grasp on that here, and I can't take the credit for it. It comes from a good team, and I think a good leadership approach to that. If the leadership embraces it, then people do too. I've certainly been in a position before where I was kind of playing Salesforce cop and trying to get people to give us data. And that is the worst possible sales operations job you can have, is Salesforce cop. Nobody wants to be that.
No, not at all. Not at all. Well, that's great. You're in a data-led culture, and that's what we love in the community and in Kluster too. Now, here's the question, Allyson. You said you're in sales ops, and then you found your way back into revenue ops. Of course, one of the key differentiators here is you're so much more focused on the broad revenue function. But my question is, something I've always tried to understand is, how do you understand the priorities of the different revenue teams? How do you understand their interests, what they're working on right now? When, of course, you couldn't have had a background in all of these types of things.
Oh my gosh, Tom, that is such a good question. I have struggled with that this year because my background was always sales. Coming in, you underestimate, because I haven't been a salesperson, but for the better part of 12 years now, I've been thinking about them, about their challenges, about what they need. And I don't even think I really understood how much of that knowledge I was walking around with until I tried to do the same thing for a marketing team this year. And never having been a marketer before, but also just not having spent a decade of my life thinking about marketing. And then I jumped into this role, and immediately, the marketing team needed my help. I think the misunderstanding there was that they needed my help with the tech. They needed my help with Salesforce and the marketing automation tool, which, while true, it wasn't as easy as, can you go into Pardot and change a setting or set up a new form? It was, you really need to understand why they need it and what they're going to do with it and why it matters. And all those things are hard to just snap your fingers and know. So my Q3 kind of focus was marketing learning for myself. And this to me looked like listening to marketing podcasts while I'm on the treadmill and like watching the marketing channel. I'm in a professional group called Revenue Collective, which is sales and marketing and ops leaders. And I'm reading the marketing channel every day. Like, what are they talking about? What are they complaining about? What are they wishing and dreaming about? And just trying to understand that. But it's been like a crash course, because there's no substitute for a decade of doing that. You can't get that in a couple months. So I think that will be a long-term thing for me, to try to understand them better. And that doesn't even take into account, like, I'm also supporting the customer success team. It's a little bit more like sales, and I've worked my sales background before. We had account managers or customer success, so I'm more comfortable there. And then, of course, like, I have this implementation and support teams too. They're all on Salesforce and trying to understand their challenges. I will say, I think marketing has been the biggest challenge for me, because it's such a discipline in and of itself. And you could just spend your whole life learning marketing. And I think, from what I can see, marketing has changed a ton too. What it was 10 years ago or 20 years ago is absolutely not what it is today. And technology has changed it, and COVID changed it this year even. So it's a really interesting space, but I'm going to be learning it for a long time, I think.
Yeah. I mean, you raised another really good question there, which is the tech. So how far does tech help us in this regard? And what fundamental skills do we need regardless of any tool?
Yeah, I think like one of the things we did, and I told you I was at my quarterly sales meeting last week. One of the things we did for that was kind of a tech reset on the marketing side with going back because they bought Pardot a year ago, and the people that were here that rolled it out are not here anymore. Very typical of startups. There's turnover and people leave. So the tech had been configured and implemented for people that are no longer here. So I think a lot of times when that happens, you start poking around in there and saying, what is this? This doesn't make any sense. And of course, only the very lucky few get documentation they can actually use and refer to try to piece it together. So instead, you're looking at it and saying, like what I did, which is we just gotta reset. We gotta go back to basics. Let's pull out some of this customization that doesn't make any sense to anybody who's here today, and just go back to like what are the basic needs that we have today, not a year ago, but right now, and then set it up for that. And then grow, like walk, crawl, run kind of thing. Wait, it's crawl, walk, run.
Yeah.
That's what it is.
Yeah.
Go in that order.
Yeah. I mean, that point of growing is a really good point. And I want to bridge into scaling, but just so I understand things first, you have 10 salespeople. How many opportunities do you think everyone's handling right now?
I mean, we probably have, so we just, when I got here, we were an enterprise sales team only. So part of our pivot this year with COVID is to create an inside sales team and start going after some more like, and I'm in healthcare, so it's a little bit different than what you would be selling into, but going into more of a small mid-market area of healthcare and creating an inside sales team. So we had to do that this year, which has been really interesting. So now we have sort of a high velocity group because when I got here, it was enterprise and it was huge health systems, kind of long sales cycles. So it was a much smaller number of opportunities. But this has all happened just in the past quarter and a half. So now we're looking at more of a volume play, which is interesting, I think, and trying to move more opportunities faster. So you need a whole different tech stack to support that than you do with a large enterprise.
Yeah, I mean, that's a great point, because my question I was going to lead on to was, how is all of this affected when we start scaling a business? This fluidity we have right now, knowing everyone, knowing maybe a lot of the opportunities just personally. How does that change when we need to scale? And I suppose a high velocity cycle would be part of a scale in a sense, wouldn't it? So what have you found out?
Yeah, so far, I mean, I think you need a lot more tech on that side to do it. Like enterprise is especially like large enterprise, it's such a personal kind of relationship sale. Whereas to support of the high velocity sale, you got to keep it moving. So actually, you might have heard my Outlook appointment reminder pop up. That's so we can go meet with Sales Loft, because we're meeting with Sales Loft and Outreach and Zant and some of these tools to help move along these sorts of deals. We're probably going to be looking at that for the beginning of the year. One of the things I did when I got here, they didn't have any because every deal was so large and unique, they didn't have a tool in place to generate proposals, contracts, pricing, that sort of thing. Yeah. So I had to build that out. When you talk about like a positive impact tech has had, that's huge for the velocity sale, is being able to just like click a couple buttons and generate pricing and get a quote. Because if you can't do that and you're waiting, those deals fall through. So that was a really high priority for us to have a system for that. Yeah. So we implemented DocuSign for that, which has been amazing.
Yeah, I mean, this is great, Allyson. It sounds like you've built so much of the foundational structure. And that leads me to wonder, what is it about RevOps that really makes you tick? Like, what makes you really excited about it? Are you a builder? Are you a process maker? Why do you love it?
My husband jokes that I'm powered by praise, and
Yeah.
it is true. I went to the sales meeting last week and people pulled me aside and said, "Thank you so much for everything you do. You help us when we're out there. You're helping us get our jobs done. You're helping us with customers." This one salesperson said, "This customer complimented the proposal and said it was really beautiful." That's, I mean, I can't do better than that. I was so happy. So I'm definitely a person who, I feel like with sales apps, there's a lot of, and I've been put in this position before too, where as a sales ops person, you're not considered a very valuable member of the team. You're more considered like I said, a Salesforce cop or someone who's enforcing process for process sake and just kind of getting in the way, being a roadblock of some kind. Um, I much more enjoy when people say to me, "You're helping me. You're helping me do things. Thank you for this thing you did that's made my life easier." Like that's where it's at for me, getting that kind of feedback.
Mm. Okay, so we've seen both sides here. We've seen both sides of the spectrum between the enforcer and the genuine, seen as being a genuine facilitator. What's fundamentally essential to, what do you need to achieve, and what questions do you need to ask to be seen as a facilitator rather than a blocker? Like, how do we create those relationships? How do other sales ops people go out there and have that kind of relationships with their sales teams?
I would say talk to the teams themselves. Don't
Yeah.
just talk to senior leadership. Senior leadership probably has some great ideas about things they want done, but they might be disconnected from what the people in the field really, really need. It can be hard to strike that balance because you got to kind of do things for both groups. Got to keep them both happy. But if you put too much in the basket of keeping the senior leadership happy, then you'll probably fall more into that bucket of person who's a roadblock or getting in my way. And I need to kind of sneak around and do things my own way because I'm just like, I don't even want to use Salesforce. It's just something painful for me. I want to try to balance between keeping both groups happy, but I think talking to the sales team, like getting to know them, or in RevOps, same thing, marketing team, support team, CS team, getting to know them, like sitting in on their calls if they'll let you, or at their desk if they'll let you. That in Salesforce, they call it Sabwa is a thing you'll hear, like Salesforce administration by walking around, because it's a Salesforce admin trait too. Like if you are building Salesforce in your house by yourself for people and not actually watching them click and seeing like where they run into problems or where they get frustrated, then you're never going to build it out right for them. So that kind of like walking around or virtually walking around is really important in this sort of job. Because having never been a seller, never been in marketing, never been in CS, I don't know personally what that job's like. So I got to go find out.
Yeah, it's kind of the difference between building something theoretically and building it with the practical knowledge of actually how it works.
Yeah. And I've seen that on Salesforce consulting projects too. Same thing. You'll get, if you don't have enough people telling you the requirements for your project that are actually going to be the ones using it, and maybe you're only meeting with like an IT person or something, and they're telling you, here's what the sales team needs, chances of project success very low. Yeah. Because you're going to have gotten your requirements from somebody who's never actually had to do it, and then it's going to go out to the actual doers and they're going to hate it.
Yeah. Okay. To finish us off, tell me about a process rollout that you've been really a process rollout or a piece of alignment you've created. We've kind of touched on to both here, so let's open it up a bit, that you've been really proud of. And what are some of the lessons you've learned from that, and some of the least expected lessons, maybe the ones you weren't aware of before it really happened and you learned them?
I'm not thinking of just one particular example, but I'm kind of thinking of a few recent examples. I think the ones that I've been most proud of, and it can be tricky because especially in startup world and in ops world, everything is, you're running at the speed of light sometimes. And It's very hard to slow down because there's a lot of pressure to execute and deliver. But if you have the time and can possibly take the time to kind of run through what it is you're going to roll out before you roll it out, so that stakeholders, not just at the top, but at all levels and layers, are understanding what it is you're doing, you're going to uncover so many things and that would trip you up. Like, I've been at the front of the room rolling out the new process, and you see those blank stares and those like, what? Why would we do this? And that's just not what you want to ever see. You want to see people nodding because they're like, oh yeah, she talked to me about this. This makes sense. So I think the ones I've been the most proud of have been the ones where people kind of already knew it was coming. It wasn't a big surprise to anybody because I'd been touching base along the way and kind of running things by people. There's so much pressure not to do that sometimes because everything was supposed to be done, yesterday in the startup world. But if you can pump the brakes just enough to get a little bit of feedback, it will make a huge difference.
It's interesting. So when we roll things out, they're not really a rollout at all. They're like the second, third stage of actually announcing this to people.
It should be, if you can. I feel like that's the key, because if it's a big like curtain unveil, you're going to get a lot more of that like, this doesn't make any sense. Yeah. I've seen those faces. I dread those faces. It's not what you want. You want to be like, oh yeah, this is what we asked for. This is what we needed. Oh, she listened when she showed me this, and I told her that this aspect didn't quite make sense, and she adjusted it. Yes. Those are the nods, just like that. That's what I want to see.
The understanding. Yeah, that's great. Okay, Allyson. Let's imagine that you are sat in a room full of RevOps, sales ops leaders, like the best in the world. What questions would you ask these people?
Oh my gosh. Let's see. I feel like I do get to sit in a room with those people. It's called LinkedIn, which is pretty cool. I follow a lot of people on LinkedIn that say many brilliant things all the time. Most of what I ask, one question I have that I ask a lot lately is how do you do all the things? I mean, if you look at all the things that fall under the ops umbrella, even sales ops, but when you expand it to rev ops, everything that falls under that umbrella, I mean, it is enough. I feel like I could have a 20-person team and we would have enough to do. So how do I do that with a 3-person team or a 2-person team? Where do you prioritize? How do you ever figure out, without working 24/7 by managing to have still some sort of a life, how do you do it all? Yeah. And everyone has, different feedback on that as far as what's most important. I think, that's the question I'm always asking people is like, what do you do first? What do you do best? How do you divide it all up? Because there's so many things we could do. Yeah. And that goes back to talking to people at your company. Like, we started this conversation saying there's no one right way. So there's never going to be like, we'll do this and then this and then this and you're golden, because those 3 are going to be different for every single company you work at. So we're back to communication, back to talking to people, learning, and just executing always.